Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
And this relates to the weapon that was used. I think I've seen the autopsy reports. I've looked at the measurements. I agree that there's a lot of injuries that are consistent with a K-bar knife. Two things, though, stick out at me. There are some injuries that are not just not consistent, but inconsistent with a K-bar knife, meaning they are far too narrow. Could it be skin stretching? I don't know. But we're talking about half a blade that would be half the width of a K-bar knife,
Are you talking about the thickness of the knife or the width of the blade?
The width of the blade. I mean, some that are like, half that, which would surprise me, which also don't show sharp edges on it. And so that question, there's also some indication of possibly a serrated blade being used. But
yeah, so the first piece on the width of the knife, I think it's important that we all agree we have to understand the depth to put sense to the width. Mm-hmm. A K-bar knife, the first few millimeters is very thin when we're talking the width. So I know exactly the part you're talking about, and I think if you go back and look, you'll see that there's some discrepancies and some disagreements on depth, and that depth is critical. Without that depth, we can't say that. Yeah. Serrated is also consistent with tearing, and I think it's important we understand the mechanism of injury like that and the brutal nature of these murders. There's also some tearing, which can also be looked at as serrated.
There is so much bullshit. So much bullshit everywhere. We're drowning in it.
Good grief. I was watching, Logan got this photo of the Kopacka knife in. And I was like, all right, I've been waiting, to get this. You got those other knives. Like, this is awesome. Because when you look at it, you can clearly see this is actually a thick blade on this knife. And you can see the double edge with the clamshell serrades on it. And it being a thick knife, but it's also when you take this blade like this and you zoom in on it, it's going to have the fine striations like you see here. See, the K-bar knife, even with a serrated edge, doesn't have these fine striations like you would see on this knife. And in a cut, when you look at it under the microscope and you hear the pathologist talking about fine striations, you see this is what fine striations look like right here. Consistent with a knife like this, because she immediately said, I didn't want this knife. This isn't consistent with the wounds. I'm like, good grief. No. It is absolutely consistent with the wounds. The 7-inch K-bar couldn't have made some of the wounds on Maddie. And even the knives that they found in the ditch with the butcher knife and the steak knife with the taped handles, the butcher knife was only 7 inches. It couldn't have created the wounds on Maddie either. This knife is 1,000% consistent with the wounds on Maddie, at least some of them, and I'll show you why. When you go to the fatal wounds on Maddie, this one right here in her right chest, it was a 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock. You see 8 o'clock into sharp. So right here, this is a wound stab wound that was 7.5 inches deep. Okay, so the K-bar knife's only 7 inches. That other butcher knife that they found with the taped handle is only 7 inches. And the only way those 7-inch knives are going to go in 7.5 inches, they would have been with so much force that it would have had to compress the chest 1/2 inch once it's all the way inserted, which means you would see some type of abrasion from the guard. This wound lists no abrasion whatsoever from anything, nothing from the guard, no kind of, triangle or square. There's no anything indicating around where the blade's inserted. So if it goes in 7.5 inches with that kind of force, then it's going to have to be a blade that's longer than 7.5 inches or not have a guard like you would have on a knife like this. So this one is absolutely consistent with the wound, not only in that way, but the width of the wound is 2 inches. So we know from the police report on this knife that it's a 2-inch wide blade and it's an 8-inch long blade. So you can't have a 2-inch, or you could have a 2-inch wide blade with a shorter knife if the blade cut, but typically when that happens, the wound is it's gonna show that the wound was cut more at the top because it would have to go at an angle. But anyways, a 2-inch wide blade, 7.5 inches deep is absolutely, this is the only blade I've seen so far of anything that's collected that's capable of making this wound without creating the, the mark for the guard. Then when we go to this wound on top of Maddie's head, it's only 1 1/4 inches deep and it's square on one side and sharp on the other. So this is absolutely impossible to be the K-bars. K-bar at 1 1/4 is double-sided sharp. So it would be points on both ends. So this was a knife that not only wasn't a K-bar, but at 1 1/4 inches, the wound is already 1 3/6 inches in width. 1 3/6 inches, 1 3/16 inches. The K-bar at full length is only a little bit less than 1 1/4 wide. At 1 1/4 inches deep, this thing at 1 3/16 inches is only consistent with the butcher style knife. It's absolutely consistent with this knife. Look, if you take it and you go in 1 1/4, so here's 1 1/4 inches, you're right here on this scale, which is almost exactly what you find in the measurements of the wound on the depth. Then you go to this one. This is the one that's the cut on the top of Maddie's head where the inferior edge of this abrasion shows fine striations. That's only going to happen with a blade like you see with the fine serrated marks that leave. These are fine striations. It's got to have these little fine striations to match up those marks. If they'd have taken this knife to the pathologist, they could have measured the striations and matched up this blade if they wanted to. They may have later. But it's absolutely consistent with those wounds. And then you've got this one right here, another one, or this is the same one with the fine striations. Okay, so then you've got this wound right here, 2 inches deep. At 2 inches, it's 1 1/4 by 3/16 inch. Approximately 1 1/4 by 3/16. 1 1/4 at 2 inches. The K-bar is only 1 1/4 at full insert, full width. But at 2 inches on the butcher knife, you're almost exactly 1 1/4. Watch this. I did these measurements on the knife. So I can take these little blocks and keep them uniform. This is an exactly 2-inch block along with 2 inches on the tape measure. And then I take and I reduce the block from here to here because this is exactly 2 inches. And what does it show? It's almost 1 1/4 inches exactly. So when you go up to, where was our wound? At 2 inches, at 1 1/4 inch width, it is perfectly consistent with that butcher knife from Kopacka's house. And once again, the fine striations are visible in this wound. The only way you should show fine striations on a stab wound is if the striations are all the way to the end. That means the serrades have to go all the way to the end of the knife. Even the K-bar with a partially serrated blade doesn't have striations going to the tip. Unlike this knife right here, the fine striations go all the way to the tip right here. Perfectly consistent with the Kopacka knife. I tell you what, my guy, what's his name? I forgot his name, but I think he had a lot of this stuff right. But these are really the only wounds in the entire autopsy report on all the victims that showed the fine striations was on Maddie. And it's also the only wounds that actually have a depth that's reached of over 7 inches. See, there was the other wound that was 7.5. There are 2 wounds right here. One of them reaches 8 inches. And guess what? It's 2 inches wide, 8 inches deep, 2 inches wide, 8 inches deep, fine striations, and the shallow wounds match it perfectly. The Kopacka knife matches the wounds on Maddie Mogan absolutely perfectly. It's my humble opinion, based on the fact that they pulled that out of the gutter right in front of his window. It's more than likely that Kopacka is one of our assailants. He used that knife, and it was Kopacka that attacked Maddie Mogan. This knife didn't attack any of the other victims because the wounds aren't consistent. Let me know your thoughts, members.